All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our February 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the South Atlantic and the Southeast Conservation Blueprints. And as many of you probably know, we host this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. to give folks a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic region. So I'm going to start out by introducing our speaker. We'll hear for 30 to 40 minutes about the monthly topic. There'll be plenty of time at the end for some Q&A and discussion. And then I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar. We don't have any staff updates today, so we'll go ahead and skip that. So as always, I'm going to put us in silent mode just to minimize any background noise, which means if you need to speak up at any time, you'll just hit *6 to unmute your phone line, or you can always pose questions using the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout the talk today. As a reminder, we are recording this web forum, and the slides and the video will be linked from the calendar event on the South Atlantic LCC website within a couple of days. That should be up by Monday or so. So before I mute everybody, does anybody have comments or questions? So today's talk will be given by Kathryn Jewell, who's a graduate research assistant in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology at NC State University. And she's going to be talking to us about how decision makers at Southeast state wildlife agencies view the evolution of wildlife conservation challenges in our region. So Kathryn, with that, I'm going to pass the presenter power over to you, and you can go ahead and share your slides. Just remember to hit *6 to unmute your phone line.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Good morning again. My name is Kathryn Jewell. I'm a first-year master's student at North Carolina State University. I'm achieving my Master's of Science in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. And my research is focused around identifying the emerging conservation priorities of directors and commissioners of wildlife agencies in the Southeast United States. So today I'm going to share some preliminary results. This is just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today. It follows your traditional flow: background, objectives and methods, results, and finally a brief discussion on my preliminary findings. So there are very many conservation challenges that the Southeast is dealing with today, and understanding what these challenges are is the first step in making effective wildlife management decisions. These challenges may vary in priority from person to person, and thus it is important to gauge opinions of stakeholder groups before making decisions. Research has done this with some groups, such as wildlife professionals, but not these decision makers. And when I say decision makers, I mean the directors, upper administrators, and supervisory board members of wildlife agencies. It may seem self-evident, but as these decision makers are the leaders of their agencies, they are the ones who make the ultimate decisions and guide their agency in a certain direction. All wildlife agencies in the Southeast have a director who is over the entire agency, as well as a supervisory board made up of the public, usually appointed by the governor. And these vary in size, and everyone calls them a little bit differently, but for today's purposes, directors, upper administrators, or hired folks will be considered directors, and any appointed supervisory board members or commissioners will be just considered board members today. So my objectives from the study are to determine the relative importance of past and present conservation challenges and the preferred responses to these challenges as told by directors and supervisory board members. So I'm doing this by conducting interviews. The qualitative method that I have employed focuses on quotations, themes, and the frequency of those. Interviews have ranged in length from 20 minutes to over an hour, but the average interview takes about 30 minutes. I'm following a pretty loose 5-question interview guide, but all in all, all but one interview has taken place over the phone. And finally, I'm using the in vivo software for my data analysis. So my study area is all of the member states and territories in the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. This includes all 15 states shown here, as well as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Thus far, I have interviewed 20 directors or people in upper administrative positions in 16 states and territories. In addition, I've interviewed 29 supervisory board members representing 13 states and territories. 88% of my sample is male, and the background of my respondents is all very varied, but all have a love of the outdoors and wildlife. So this next section is going to outline my preliminary results. I'll go through each question and talk about the top 5 most common responses in each category. So I do want to go ahead and mention that qualitative research is all about the frequency of themes. After all of my interviews, I sit down and I put quotes into thematic bins, which is how I came to the numbers that I'm going to be talking about today. All of my data here is quotes, and the themes that have the most quotes are what I'm going to talk about today. For the first question, I asked respondents to describe the wildlife management and conservation challenges that their state has faced in the last 30 years. 5 main themes emerged: lack of funding, low game abundance, wildlife disease, introduction and spread of invasive species, and threats surrounding urbanization. The numbers on the slide depict the number of respondents that talked about that category. For example, a lack of funding was mentioned by 20 of the total respondents. A lack of funding was perceived to be the main issue. I think this category is well summed up by this first selected quote. The funding model in this state needs some adjustment. We are funded by license dollars and Pittman-Robertson funds and things like that. But with a decreasing number of hunters and increased cost and upkeep, it does not work. Yes, this category is addressing the lack of general funding, but also it does include mentioning the declining hunters and fishermen license sales, which directly impacts funding available. And for those of you who are unaware, the Pittman-Robertson Fund is a federal fund that comes from a general sales tax on guns and ammunition, and all of that money goes back to the wildlife agencies across the country. The second most common challenge was described to be low game abundance. Within this category, 4 specific species were mentioned: black bear, white-tailed deer, upland game birds, and wild turkeys. When you think about the history of wildlife in the Southeast, this category makes sense, as herds and populations were much smaller in the late 20th century. It shows the success of our wildlife agencies when you hear something like the second quote. I think back as a child, we didn't have much deer in this state. The herd was small, but the agency did a fantastic job on management. The third most common challenge was perceived to be wildlife disease. I'm sure this comes to no surprise with the spread of chronic wasting disease in our white-tailed deer and elk herds. And of the 15 people that talked about wildlife disease, 13 of those specifically mentioned chronic wasting disease. CWD was not the only disease mentioned, as the blue tongue virus and epizootic hemorrhagic disease, or EHD, was also discussed, just not as frequently. I think the intensity of this challenge is exemplified in the second quote on this slide. Oh boy, I'll start with the most obvious one. Chronic wasting disease, and we are vulnerable as far as a policy standpoint. The fourth most common challenge was described to be the introduction and spread of invasive species. Of the 15 people that talked about invasive species, 5 of those talked about feral hogs, and 4 mentioned Asian carp as 2 of the species that are currently an issue in the Southeast. I think this category is really represented by this first quote. The introduction of feral swine back in the 1970s, they were moving them around, and now we're dealing with the unintended consequences. It's important to mention that some of these issues have not gone away, and the states are still dealing with these today, but we'll get that a little bit later. And finally, to round out the challenges of yesterday, we have threats surrounding urbanization. Within this category, there are a few important themes that I want to mention, and they are increased fragmentation of landscapes, conversion of natural landscapes specifically due to urbanization, and increased human-wildlife interactions. Increased human populations are forcing wildlife agencies to adapt to these changing conditions, as described in this first quote. Now we have over 5.5 million people, and any time a new subdivision or shopping center is built, it takes away from forest and game. So as a follow-up to that first question, I asked respondents to describe the solutions that their state has adopted in response to these challenges. The top 5 perceived solutions are to acquire land, create new partnerships, improve legislation, improve hunting and fishing regulations, and to restore game species populations. The most common solution to yesterday's challenge is to acquire land. Buying land serves a multitude of different purposes, from setting up conservation easements to saving land for imperiled species. This first quote, we've purchased over 100,000 acres for land in the last 10 years, exemplifies how important that acquiring land really is. The second most common solution is to create new partnerships. Again, this can take on many forms. This could mean discussing an issue with the state next door or working with non-governmental organizations to achieve a common goal, among others. Working with other organizations not only allows you to be collaborative and reach a larger audience, but can also improve the amount of funding dedicated to a task. The third solution that decision makers perceive is improving legislation. As I will mention on the next slide, this is different from hunting and fishing regulations. This category is talking about collaborating and working with legislature to achieve amending or creating rules and laws. Usually this means working with state legislatures to get funding, or in some instances, the state legislature may have a say in what the agency is spending their money on. Another method perceived to mitigate solutions is improving hunting and fishing regulations. Shifting fish and game regulations allows agencies to change the amount of pressure put on a resource to protect the population for the future. In some instances, regulations are put in place for scientific reasons, such as monitoring for chronic wasting disease positive deer. We have a mandatory requirement for testing in those counties that have reported chronic wasting disease cases. The fifth most common solution to yesterday's challenges is to restore game species populations. This is done through a variety of methods, but the most common methods are restocking species and reestablishing populations, which was common with elk and wild turkey. So let's move on to today. The top 5 most common perceived challenges are lack of funding, wildlife disease, the agency becoming irrelevant, introduction and spread of invasive species, and conversion of natural landscapes. I won't talk too much about the categories that have carried over from the past, as the definition of the theme is the same. The most common challenge for today mentioned is, again, a lack of funding. Agencies not having enough money is a common trend against time, but I do want to note that more people said funding was an issue today than it has been in the past. Quotes are also very heavy in the declining license sales, and this respondent even mentioned that they've got to create a new funding paradigm. The second most common challenge of today is wildlife disease. Again, the majority were talking about chronic wasting disease. I did find this first quote striking. More and more disease issues that are coming about that you're having to address. The third most common challenge of today is a new one, the agency becoming irrelevant. Many respondents noted that we are in a time of rapid change, and their agencies have to keep up with the times in order to be relevant. This is in line with changing values and a shift to a more mutualistic relationship with wildlife, as well as the demographics of states changing. A common sub-theme of this as well is a loss of connection with the outdoors. With so many electronic distractions today, both children and adults are losing that connection that so many of us grew up with. Both of these quotes on the screen reflect this, and there are so many more that I found to be representative of this relevancy issue. The fourth most common challenge is the introduction and spread of invasive species. As before, respondents listed a number of different species, and feral hogs and Asian carp were mentioned again, as well as new species such as the python and aquatic invasive plants. The fifth most common challenge of today is the conversion of natural landscapes. This is separate from urbanization because respondents were not always talking about urban centers spreading, but in this instance, more on land use changes and the fragmentation of natural land, as well as maintaining a variety of habitat types for both game and non-game species. So let's round out these results with the most common solutions mentioned for today. They are outreach and marketing, recruiting staff, creating new partnerships, acquiring land, and improving legislation. Outreach and marketing were the most common solution for today's problems. This includes getting out into the community as well as the expansion and creation of R3 programs. In case you don't know, this stands for Recruitment, Retention, and Reactivation of Hunters and Anglers. Many states have a full R3 plan, and in my more recent interviews, they've also mentioned the Roadmap to Relevancy that was just released late last year. I really like this first quote. Very focused on our outreach and engagement programs. They are very targeted on how you can create families of outdoor enthusiasts. This shows how agencies are moving to target all age groups, both youth and adults. The second most common solution is recruiting staff. This category also goes along with marketing and outreach, as agencies are hiring staff that they may not have had before, like R3 coordinators. This is not limited to just R3. There is a focus on recruiting staff that understands today's issues and have ideas on how to work with them. And we're trained at universities like Georgia, Auburn, NC State, Mississippi State, etc., that are training the next generation of wildlife professionals. The third most common solution is creating new partnerships. Similar to in the past, working with others on a common goal allows for shared knowledge and experiences and can help solve the challenges of today. The fourth most common solution is to acquire land. This is also carried over from the past, and agencies are still looking to have more land for wildlife to live and thrive, as well as protect land for the future with their conservation easement program. And for those who don't know, a conservation easement program is simply putting a mark on a land that intends that it will stay natural and whole, it won't be split up. The fifth most common solution is to improve legislation. There was a lot of mention in this category about Recovering America's Wildlife Act and, hoping that it gets through the legislature. Again, this was mainly focused on state legislature, like setting up prescribed fire training, but there was an increase in national legislation as well. So to wrap up these results, funding has consistently been viewed as the primary challenge, and it does not look it's going to go away anytime soon. Other challenges have shifted, however, from dealing with low game abundance to maintaining relevancy. And wildlife disease and invasive species have also persisted as major challenges across time. And in the solution category, marketing and outreach have become the most important perceived solution. That being said, partnerships, legislation, and land acquisition have persisted on to be an important method of tackling today's challenges. I also wanted to mention that while I did talk about funding quite a bit, there is not a ton on improving funding. So I thought it was important to note that some decision makers are working towards changing the funding model. This has been done through different taxes, but are also now in brainstorming to figure out what's going to work best. So given the centrality of funding challenges, there may be benefits from tackling this funding issue more directly. Similarly, agencies may benefit from focusing their hiring initiatives and staff with skills aligned for today and tomorrow's challenges, especially disease specialists and environmental educators. A takeaway from this result is that there's a large percentage of states who think partnerships are a very important solution in today's world, and I hope that inspires further collaboration across agencies. And finally, there are dozens of state programs that are focused on diversifying stakeholders, hiring new types of staff, and increasingly diversifying funding. Given this rapid proliferation of programs, a systematic review into highlighting patterns of success would be very beneficial to all agencies in the Southeast. And before we move on to questions and discussion, I would like to thank the support of North Carolina State's Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Program, as well as the help of Fish and Wildlife Services Science Applications, the Southeastern Climate Adaptation Science Center, and especially Emily Calicut for helping me with typing all of the notes for some of the initial interviews. And without further ado, I'll take any questions that you guys have.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathryn. Great presentation. Plenty of time for Q&A, folks, so please feel free to jump in. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody, take us into talk mode here.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So now you should be able to just manage your own mute button, so please do be mindful of keeping yourself on mute if you're not talking, just so we don't get background noise. But does anybody have questions for Kathryn? Feel free to speak up or use the chat box.
Hey, Kathryn, this is Brian Crawford. I guess I'll start. Yeah, I'm a researcher down at University of Georgia and just saw a presentation last week from Lincoln Larson, who's in the Human Interventions Department at NCSU. So yeah, really great presentation. I've been thinking about this stuff a lot in the last week, but I guess could you expand more on something you mentioned, like with their feelings of being irrelevant? I guess that surprised me a little bit, and you said you had more quotes. So yeah, like, is it more based on your interviews? Was it more a feeling of being completely irrelevant, or like their mission is change, or their mission has to change, or something like that? I guess I just found a feeling of total irrelevance surprising.
Yeah, so that both things you mentioned, it kind of goes into that. So relevancy in terms that the hunting population is shrinking, and that it's important to embrace new constituents, as well as in a changing world, we have to, make sure we're handling everyone's needs. And as well, I did have a bunch of people mention how they would like to reevaluate their goals and maintain that their mission and their purpose is as broad as possible, as to reach the most people possible. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think more or less it was. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I probably have more, but yeah, I need to think about that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, the relevancy thing is huge, and there's actually a lot of things that go into relevancy that we considered, and a lot of people, a lot of interviews did specifically say we need to maintain relevant, specifically, to everyone and not just hunters and fishers.
Gotcha.
Anglers, excuse me.
Yeah, that if I may just like ask a second question while I have you, and then I'll stop talking. But it's based on that, like based on the future priorities, it seems like you got the sense from your interviews that the focus was more on keeping the current model of funding and the current focus of, let's make more hunters through the R3 program. Was that the priority, instead of maybe embracing a little more flexible model and trying to find new ways to get funding that aren't based on hunters? Like, I know there's been other sales tax proposed. They failed in the past, but they could be re-evaluated now, on like binoculars and kayaks and some non-hunting, non-game related outdoors materials. I know that's been proposed, but just did you get the sense that people are still trying to make the old model work instead of changing the model, I guess is my question.
I would say from my discussions, there's a general feeling of kind of both. Obviously, they want to increase our hunter populations, but also it's expanding to everyone uses game lands. That user pay support system, it may have worked in the past, but I get the sense that people are both trying to maintain or increase our hunter and angler numbers, as well as expand the funding opportunities to like a general sales tax on binoculars and other wildlife equipment that is non-traditional.
Great, thank you, and great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take presenter power back just to give a quick preview of next month's web forum, and then at the end we'll stop again for questions. So if something occurs to you between now and then, just hang on to it and we'll have time to address it. So let me share my presentation again. Next month, our web forum will be on Thursday, March 19th, same time, same connection information as today. And Rua Mordecai, who, as you probably know, is the coordinator for the South Atlantic and the Southeast Conservation Blueprints, will be giving that talk. You'll be hearing about the updates that are planned for the 2020 revision of the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. We're planning to release a draft of this next South Atlantic Blueprint update this summer for review, in time for it to be incorporated into the next version of the Southeast Blueprint as well, which will be scheduled for release this fall. So Rua and Amy in particular have been working on lots of great improvements to the South Atlantic Blueprint. We have a new greenways and trails indicator. They've been playing with some improvements to patch size, to depiction of riparian areas, incorporating rare reptiles and amphibians, exploring a finer spatial resolution, and lots of good stuff. We're going to try to fit as many of those improvements as we can into this update. Anything that we don't get to, we'll save for a subsequent blueprint revision. We're tentatively hoping to do another one next year in 2021 as well. And we'd like to do a full round of blueprint workshops, but we're still kind of figuring out the timeline. So I just wanted to let everybody know that this South Atlantic Blueprint update is coming up, and next month will be a great opportunity for you to tune in and hear more from Rua about the updates and the improvements that we have on deck. So as always, I like to end on this slide. I really encourage you to get more involved in the Blueprint by joining the South Atlantic LCC web community. That'll get you signed up for our monthly newsletter and for a monthly reminder email about this web forum. You can always connect with your Blueprint staff. That's me and Rua and Amy and Louise and Mallory here in Raleigh, or you can explore the Conservation Blueprint online. We'd love to help you use it in your decision making or to help bring in new funding to support your work. We're here to help you with that for free. And of course, we love your feedback on how well it's working for you so we can help make it better. So with that, I'm going to pause again for questions, either for me or for Kathryn, if anything else has occurred to you. All right, if not, that's it for me today. Enjoy the remaining half hour of your morning. Nice short and sweet one today. Thanks again, Kathryn, so much for that great presentation. That was really interesting, and appreciate you all tuning in. Hope you'll join us in March.